Welcome back, Recruit. We've already discussed how you can store Python data objects using a list or a dictionary. Now let's learn about tuples. Tuples are actually very similar to a list. They're ordered sequences of objects, just like a list. However, there's two key differences. One is that they use a slightly different syntax than a list. They use parentheses instead of square brackets. Here you can see an example of a tuple. We call this variable myTuple, and it's equal to, in parentheses, 1, 2, 3. So very similar to a list in syntax, except we're using parentheses instead of square brackets. The other major difference, and this is the most fundamental one, is that tuples are what we call immutable. So mutability refers to the ability to change or alter. It comes from the word mutate or mutation. Once you've assigned an object to a position in a tuple, you cannot reassign it. In a list, you could do this reassignment. However, in a tuple, you cannot. Let's explore how to work with tuples in Python by loading up a Jupyter Notebook. Let's begin by creating an example tuple. We'll say my tuple is equal to, and it's going to be really similar to a list, except now we're using parentheses here. We'll say 1, 2, 3. And if I check the type of this object, my tuple, it returns back that it's a tuple type. And just like a list, you can also use mixed data types. So we could say T is another tuple where we have a string mixed in with an integer, mixed in with a float, and tuple doesn't mind. And you can use indexing or slicing just like you would with a list. So if I wanted that letter A, I could just use that bracket notation just like we used with a list. However, the key difference here is the immutability of a tuple. So I'm going to create my list, 1, 2, 3. Let's check the type of my list to confirm that it in fact is a list. So it is, and then we still have my original tuple, 1, 2, 3. One is a list, one is a tuple. So let's imagine that I wanted to reassign the first item in my list, so that is the item at index location 0, to be something new. Well, I can easily do that by saying my list at 0 is equal to new. And then if I check out my list, now I have new, 2, 3. If I tried to do the same thing with that tuple object I created, I'm going to get an error. And if I say new here, it's going to say type error, the tuple object does not support item assignment. And that means that I can't add in or replace the objects that are already inside that tuple. You'll also notice that once I've created that tuple and I check out the available methods, it's just count and index. There's no way I can append something else that's new. It'll say, hey, tuple has no object, or the tuple object has no attribute append. So that means that there's really only two methods you can do with a tuple, and that is indexing and counting. So I will create a tuple object, A, B, C, and let's say A again. So I have A, B, C, and A. If I wanted to find out the first occurrence of B, I can say T index, pass in B, and it will return back the index location of the first time B occurs inside this tuple. If I wanted to count how many times an object occurs inside this tuple, I can say T and then use the count method and ask it how many times does a string A show up in this tuple, and it returns back that it shows up twice. Now you may be wondering, why would you ever use tuples since they have this immutability aspect to them? You should use a tuple for collections or sequences that shouldn't be changed. Things like the dates of the year or user information where you want the order to remain the same. And let's actually show you an example of this. Recall that when we were creating a dictionary, so I say A has the value 1 and B key is going to have the value 2. So I have this dictionary. When I called the items of my dictionary, I got back this list or sort of brackets of tuples. And the reason we're using tuples here is because this allows me to know whenever the method or whatever code that is behind the scenes of this items called is using tuples because it knows that this order can't be switched around. So you're using tuples when you want to make sure that you don't have any changes occurring. So this is basically almost like a slight security feature of your data type in the sense that you're not going to be able to accidentally re-index something and then reassign it. Here I know that the first item in this tuple is going to be the key, and the second item in the tuple is going to be the value associated with it. And there's lots of built-in functions and methods in Python that return lists of tuple items, as we've seen here. And later on, when we discuss for loops, we'll see how we can use something called tuple unpacking to work with these functions and methods that return back lists of tuple objects. For now, just keep in mind that tuples, the main difference here is that syntax-wise, you're constructing them with a parentheses, and that they do not support item reassignment. They're immutable objects. I'll see you at the next lesson, Recruit.